Welcome to God and Country Biblical Exposition. In my last YouTube, I covered the upcoming Equality Act, and that was a further example of the moral decline in our culture. I concluded by saying, when a nation arrives at this level of depravity, the cure is described in Isaiah chapter 4, verse 4. When the Lord has washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and purged the bloodshed of Jerusalem from her midst, by the spirit of judgment and the spirit of burning. And I promise to follow up that statement with some programs about what the Bible has to say about God reestablishing his authority on earth whenever it's challenged. Now, last week's program was part one. Some introductory remarks to straighten out the misconception that spiritual revival means the saving of a nation, when in fact a revival on the part of God's people can actually mean judgment upon a nation. But now today, I want to look at this whole concept of God reestablishing his authority. And let me begin with Proverbs 28:28. When the wicked rise, men hide themselves, but when they perish, the righteous increase. And the premise here is that there are times when the wicked rise in the land, a time when Ahab and Jezebel ruled in northern Israel, a time when wicked King Manasseh ruled in southern Israel. Men have always been sinners. But the Bible teaches us that there are times when wickedness is empowered. As it says in Psalm 92, times when the wicked spring up like grass. In the first world, Genesis chapter 6, the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Then God sent the flood, and God reestablished his authority. At the Tower of Babel, Genesis chapter 11, mankind began to organize into a one-world government. God knew that this would empower the wicked. Nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. So God confused the language and reestablished his authority. Then in Genesis chapter 19, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were given over to homosexuality, and this threatened the proliferation of evil throughout the entire world. So 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 6, God condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction by reducing them to ashes, having made them an example to those who would live ungodly lives thereafter. Then there were the Canaanites, who occupied the land of Palestine. When their iniquity was full, God destroyed them. God even told Abraham about the destruction of the Canaanites 400 years before it took place. Genesis 15:16. Then in the fourth generation, they, the Jews, will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. So God, in his omniscience, already knew when he would reestablish his authority there in the Middle East. The 10 plagues that came upon Egypt reestablished God's authority. Exodus chapter 14, verse 31. When Israel saw the great power which the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and his servant Moses. In the destruction of Israel and the ensuing exile in 586 BC, was God reestablishing his authority over sinful Israel. Ezekiel chapter 7, verse 4, for my eye will have no pity on you, nor will I spare you, but I will bring your ways upon you, and your abominations will be upon you. Then you will know that I'm the Lord. Ezekiel 12:20, the inhabited cities will be laid waste, and the land will be a desolation, so you will know that I am the Lord. 23 times in the book of Ezekiel, this phrase, then they will know I am the Lord, is used. The point is that the goal of judgment is the reestablishment of respect for God. And this wasn't simply for Israel. In all of the biblical oracles against the nations, against Assyria, against the Moabites, against Babylon, Egypt, the goal was to stop sin, to judge sin, and to disempower sinners. What about the New Testament? Well, God reestablishes authority in the church in Acts chapter 5. in the case of Ananias and Sapphira, who were struck dead. Acts chapter 5, verse 11, and then a great fear came over the whole church and over all who heard these things. God reestablishes authority in Acts chapter 12, when Herod, who had put James, the brother of John, to death, was struck dead by an angel. Acts chapter 12, verse 24, then the word of the Lord continued to grow and multiply. God reestablishes authority in the city of Philippi by sending an earthquake that released Paul and Silas from prison. Acts chapter 16, verse 36, the magistrates of that city all of a sudden had a change of opinion toward Paul and his team. In Acts chapter 27, God sent a storm, and it wrecked the prison ship Paul was aboard, and the Roman soldiers had a new respect for the Apostle Paul. The destruction of Israel and the nation of Israel in AD 70 reestablished God's authority in the first century there. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 16, Paul speaking about his own people, the Jews, hindering us from speaking to the Gentiles so that they may be saved, with the result that they're always filling up the measure of their sins, but wrath has come upon them to the uttermost. What effect did this have on the Jewish people? Revelation 3:9. Behold, I will cause those of the synagogue of Satan, who say they are Jews and are not, but lie, I will make them come and bow down at your feet and make them know that I have loved you. Here's an analogy, a mental picture that's been helpful for me. Picture a cart rolling down a hill. It reaches the bottom, a hand picks up the cart and puts it back up on top of the hill, and then the cart rolls down the hill again, and again the hand has to reach down, pick up the cart, and put it back on top of the hill. The hill and the cart are man's natural propensity toward greater and greater rebellion against God, greater and greater depravity. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 13, evil men and impostors will proceed from bad to worse. It's the second law of thermodynamics applied to morals. Things move toward disorder. But what happens is God steps into human history to reverse the course of human regression. Otherwise, the world would be unlivable for God's people. And God's main goal is the salvation and the sanctification of his people. That's why God is allowing evil to have a short period of reign in the first place. It's necessary to test, to refine, to educate his people in every generation. We would not fare very well spiritually if we were not tested in our faith. I mean, without struggles, we would be very weak. So God allows times in which the wicked thrive for our good, for the sake of the elect, and please don't see it any other way. As if God is in a fight, sometimes he wins, sometimes he loses, as if sometimes the dark side of the force wins and other times the good side of the force wins. No, that's complete nonsense. God is in complete control over evil. God has created all things for himself, even the wicked, for the day of evil. God even raised up Pharaoh in order to demonstrate his power. Romans chapter 9. Well, back to the subject at hand. I love the way C.S. Lewis describes humanity's downward trajectory in his book Mere Christianity. Quote, that is the key to history. Terrific energy is expended, civilizations are built up, excellent institutions devised, but each time something goes wrong. Some fatal flaw always brings the selfish and the cruel people to the top, and then it all slides back into misery and ruin. In fact, the machine conks. It seems to start up all right, run a few yards, and then it breaks down. Unquote. Well, that breakdown includes the self-inflicted punishment that comes with sin and God's direct judgment against the sins of a nation, the sins that are built up over time. Every civilization has a shelf life because people in their sin store up wrath for the day of wrath, and then God soon reestablishes his authority. There was an interesting BBC article that was trending on the internet last week. Are we on the road to civilization collapse? Studying the demise of historic civilizations can tell us how much risk we face today, says collapse expert Luke Kemp. The signs are worsening. I didn't know there's such a thing as a collapse expert. Well, the article reads, great civilizations are not murdered, instead they take their own lives. So concluded the historian Arnold Toynbee in his 12-volume magnus opus, A Study of History. It was an exploration of the rise and fall of 28 different civilizations. Well, Toynbee had a very secular, ungodly view of history, but he did get one thing right. Civilizations do not last, and civilizations are responsible for their own decline. Here's a chart from the article. The length of major civilizations, about 300 years. Sometimes I wonder why certain articles trend at certain times. There are people trying to manipulate public perceptions. Luke Kemp, who put out this article, is a global warming alarmist. He is with the Climate Change Institute, and this piece is put together to promote the global warming hysteria and the need for socialism. The article claims that civilizations fail because of increased social complexities, income inequalities, and environmental factors. Well, the biblical explanation is that civilizations fall because of sin. Sinners are empowered by great organizations, and then they break away from God's authority. Selfish and cruel people come to the top, and then the whole thing slides back into misery and ruin. God reestablishes his authority on earth, and the nations learn that he's the Lord. And this is done so that his people are trained and tested, and then so that they will eventually be delivered. Psalm 46:10. Cease striving and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. Isaiah 33:10. Now I will arise, says the Lord. Now I will be exalted. Now I will be lifted up. These scriptures are all about this overlooked theme of God reestablishing his authority on earth. Also Ezekiel 38:23. I will magnify myself, sanctify myself, and make myself known in the sight of many nations, and they will know that I am the Lord. If you want to study this further, notice the biblical description of this period of time before God reestablishes his authority. This time when God lets sin run rampant. It's described in the Bible as the time of God's silence and his restraint. Isaiah 42:14, I have kept silent for a long time. I have kept still and restrained myself. Now like a woman in labor I will groan. I will both gasp and pant. I will lay waste the mountains and the hills. In Jeremiah 15:6, it's described as a time of God's relenting. You who have forsaken me, declares the Lord, you keep going backward. So I will stretch out my hand against you and destroy you. I am tired of relenting. The word here, relenting, is this Hebrew word naham, which means God repenting or choosing to restrain himself from judgment, only for a little while. And it's during this intermediate period before judgment that God's people pray that God would reestablish his authority. Psalm 119, 126, the psalmist prays, it's time for the Lord to act, for they have broken your law. Psalm 9:19, arise, O Lord, do not let man prevail. Let the nations be judged before you. Put them in fear, O Lord. Let the nations know that they are but men. And Psalm 83, O God, do not remain quiet. Do not be silent, O God. Do not be still, for behold, your enemies make an uproar, and those who hate you have exalted themselves. This is the prayer of God's people that God will reestablish his authority, that sin would be taken care of. And God's people are certainly praying this today as we see the empowerment of evil in our present day. And God's answer to the prayer of his people is always an assurance that he will reestablish his authority. Evil will not continue long. It will not win. Isaiah chapter 2, verse 11, God's answer to his people is that the proud look of man will be abased, and the loftiness of man will be humbled, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. What day? Well, the day that God judges evil and reestablishes his authority. Isaiah chapter 2, verse 17, the pride of man will be humbled, and the loftiness of man will be abased, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. Isaiah 5:16, but the Lord of hosts will be exalted in judgment, and the holy God will show himself holy in righteousness. I love the words of Martin Luther's hymn, "A mighty fortress is our God. We will not fear, for God has willed his truth to triumph through us." Do we really believe this? Or are we still worried and intimidated by the overwhelming onslaught of the ungodly in our nation, those who want to turn the nation to Sodom? Remember, God has told us many times that the wicked are toast. A few verses here, Psalm 11:6. Upon the wicked he will rain snares. Fire and brimstone and burning wind will be the portion of their cup. Psalm 21:11. Though they intend evil against you and devise a plot, they will not succeed. Psalm 27:2. When evildoers came upon me to devour my flesh, my adversaries and my enemies, they stumbled and fell. Though a host encamped against me, my heart will not fear. The war arises against me. In spite of this, I shall be confident. Psalm 27:6. And now my head will be lifted up above my enemies around me. Psalm 28:5. Because they do not regard the works of the Lord, nor the deeds of his hand, he will tear them down and not build them up. Psalm 33:10. The Lord nullifies the counsel of nations. He frustrates the plans of the people. Psalm 34:16. The face of the Lord is against evildoers, to cut off the memory of them from the earth. Psalm 34:21. Evil shall slay the wicked, and those who hate the righteous will be condemned. And I could read another 1,000 verses reiterating the same truth. But in our weakness, we don't remember and we don't believe this truth. When will the Christians in America begin to believe and proclaim this message? That the days of the wicked are numbered, their end is very soon, God will reestablish his authority, and people will again know that he is the Lord. Well, we ask when. Now, ultimately, the complete fulfillment of this promise will be at the coming of Jesus Christ. Remember in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, Paul tells the Christians that the ultimate deliverance comes when the Lord Jesus Christ will be revealed from heaven with his mighty angels in flaming fire, dealing out retribution to those who do not obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. However, it's not as if all deliverance waits until the end. As I pointed out earlier, God has reestablished his authority throughout history whenever sin proliferates. Proverbs chapter 11, verse 31, if the righteous will be rewarded on earth or in the earth, how much more the wicked and the sinners? The only question we have is not whether God will reestablish his authority, but whether the next reestablishment of his authority on earth will be the final apocalypse itself. Is the plan of God some readjustment to carry the world on for just another 250, 300, 500 years? Or will the next reestablishment of God's authority be the end? Are we in that final rebellion prophesied in the New Testament? Now, there are a few indicators we may be in that age. Israel's back in the land. There are new powers of communication and technology. There's this push for globalism, one world government, the UN. The debauchery in Germany in the 1930s and even the rise of Hitler was kind of local, but the debauchery in the world today is pretty much worldwide. There's great blood guilt upon the world. Since 1980, there has been 1.5 billion abortions. I was about to say million, but it's billion. I actually had to go and check out that figure because it was just so outrageous. But even the Guttmacher Institute, the pro-abortion think tank, says that since 1980, worldwide there's been 1.5 billion abortions. So the sexual revolution and the bloodshed are worldwide. The delay of judgment in our generation is actually unusual. It seems like other generations were judged for far less crimes. But this delay may be due to that biblical prophecy that at the end of the age there will be a special removal of God's restraints to allow the wicked to fully expose their evil right before the day of judgment. And this seems to be the teaching of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, that there will be a unique removal of God's restraint right before the apocalypse. So it may have to get a whole lot worse before it gets a whole lot better. God's goal is to fully expose evil before he judges it. So evil may have to strut itself on the stage for a few more years before it will be stopped. But it will be stopped. So in conclusion, let me leave you with one important biblical teaching in regard to God reestablishing his authority. It's kind of an obvious lesson, but it's so obvious we often miss it. And this truth has been made more clear to me in recent years. When God moves to set things straight, he is the one who will bring the deliverance, not you, not me. Psalm 44:3. For by their own sword they did not possess the land, and their own arm did not save them. But your right hand and your arm and the light of your presence. Now, that's kind of hard for us to understand, because we tend to think, especially conservatives, God helps those who help themselves. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. I mean, even Gideon had to do something to defeat the Midianites. Even Noah had to build an ark. And I find conservatives fear coming to the conclusion that we are beat, that there's nothing we can do, lest our defeat will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. But that attitude of self-reliance can be a serious error. Because if we look back at all the times when God brought deliverance to his people, it was when his people were helpless, when their strength was gone, when they finally realized there was nothing that they can do to defeat evil within and without. Deuteronomy 32:36. For the Lord will vindicate his people, and he will have compassion on his servants when he sees that their strength is gone. Notice the whole context here. God destroys the evil. Vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord. And this was the case when the righteous king Hezekiah was surrounded by the Assyrian army. 2 Chronicles 20, verse 12. O our God, will you not judge them? For we are powerless before this great multitude who are coming against us, nor do we know what to do. But our eyes are on you. Well, this is the situation we are in today. Christians don't make up the majority of this country. We don't have the moral majority. We don't own the culture. We don't have the money. We don't have the strategy. We don't have the influence. We are never in our own strength going to turn this nation around. And I think it's a mistake to think that if the Christians just get active, we can change America. I believe that's a naive position. The reality of the situation is that even if we do get active, we don't have the power. But that shouldn't discourage us, because we've never been able to change this nation. God is the one who supernaturally has to step into history to save the day. Very often without our help, without our participation. Of course, we continue to obey the Great Commission, but there are times where God's people need to stand back and see the salvation of the Lord. Exodus 14. And looking back at that text, Israel at the Red Sea. The attitude of many Christians today would be analogous to some of the Israelites trying to tell Moses, hey, maybe we should start building a bridge across the Red Sea. Or maybe we should start building rafts. Or maybe we should try fighting the Egyptians. Such Israelites would have been quite naive concerning their situation. And the reality of our situation is that the only cure is going to be a supernatural work of God. And God is honored when we finally acknowledge our helplessness. That's not laziness. That's not just letting go and letting God. It's simply humble recognition of our inability to save the world. Isaiah 26, verse 18. We could not accomplish deliverance for the earth. And so the text goes on to say, the Lord had to come out of his place. There's a bit more material I'd like to cover on this topic. I'd like to look deeper into the specifics of how God reestablishes his authority, like he did at the Tower of Babel. And that will be next week's program. Now some commentary on the culture. I picked up this little booklet that was recommended to me by a listener, That Hideous Strength, How the West Was Lost. And here's a good quote explaining why I do commentary on the culture. Cultural literacy is the ability to read and to make sense of what is happening in our contemporary situation. Evangelical leaders must get up to speed on what is happening to help those to whom it is happening. And that's the reason for this program. Helping Christians become culturally literate, helping them to get up to speed on what's happening in order to help them go through what's happening. Or in the words of the New Testament, Colossians chapter 2, so that you're not taken captive through philosophy and empty deception. Or Ephesians chapter 4, so you're not carried about by every wind of doctrine and the trickery of men. Well, the first informative news story is Senator Ben Sasse's Born Alive Abortion Survivor Protection Act. This law would legally mandate doctors provide medical care to babies born alive after botched abortions. The bill was the Republicans' response to the new New York State law allowing abortion right up to the moment of birth, and to the governor of Virginia's comments on killing children born alive. Every single Democrat voted to block the bill, going on record in support of infanticide. Senator Tim Scott from Florida excoriated the Democrats for their action. Quote, "We are a nation that must continue to value life. And for some reason, somehow this body missed that opportunity to reinforce that value system before the American public. To say each child born, no matter your state, no matter your challenges, you have an intrinsic value." But what is frustrating even more than that is that we would be debating, having a conversation about a child who is born, sitting there alive, separated from her mother, and that there would be a question of whether or not that child should be able to continue to live. The moral depravity and blindness in our country is astounding. But remember, this is the evil nature of those who are dead in their trespasses and in their sins. Those, as it says in Ephesians chapter 2, who walk according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that's now working in the sons of disobedience. These unsaved souls are in agreement with Satan. And Satan was a murderer from the beginning. Here's a verse, Jeremiah 22:17. "But your eyes and your heart are intent only upon your own dishonest gain, and on shedding innocent blood, and on practicing oppression and extortion." So in their sin, these people shed innocent blood for personal gain. They shed innocent blood because of their selfishness. Their hearts do not possess the sacrificial love of God. Dr. Seuss had this all figured out. I was reading to my grandson the other day, Dr. Seuss's Horton Hatches the Egg. Lazy Maisie did not want to sit on her nest and hatch her egg. She wanted to go on vacation. And so she talks Horton the elephant into doing the job for her. Then Horton the elephant passed by the tree. Hello, called the lazy bird, smiling her best. You've nothing to do, and I do need a rest. Would you like to sit on the egg in my nest? So Horton takes the job. And Maisie, by this time, was far from beyond reach, enjoying the sunshine way off in Palm Beach, and having such fun, such wonderful rest, decided she'd never go back to her nest. Well, first of all, this story was written back in the 1940s. And the sad thing is that this story could not be written today. It would be considered too judgmental toward lazy parents. This is how much our culture has changed. And second, at least lazy Maisie had enough conscience to have someone else take the egg. I mean, if she was like today's Democrats, she would have just crushed the egg and then go on vacation. The story is just a great reminder of why parents have abortions in the first place. Irresponsibility, selfishness. Stephen Crowder last week put out an undercover video in an abortion clinic, and one of the women in the lobby was having an abortion at 28 weeks. And her reason? She already had 2 children, and it was just too much trouble to have a third. So she killed the child for personal convenience and gain. Jeremiah 22:17. But your eyes and your heart are intent only upon your dishonest gain and on shedding innocent blood. Notice the selfishness that is motivating the murder. And one has to be extremely heartless to kill a baby in the womb. Because when you get an abortion, they inject poison into the baby, and then you have to go through the ordeal of walking around with a dead baby for a day or two until your body naturally expels the dead body. I used to think that women are sugar and spice and everything nice, as the old nursery rhyme goes. But no, they're just as depraved as the men. Dr. Seuss actually had another pro-life story. Horton hears a who. My grandson enjoyed this one too. A person's a person, no matter how small. The second item, some follow-up to comments I made last week about AOC, Congresswoman Cortez, and her new Green Deal. California Senator Dianne Feinstein was approached by a group of children, a group called the Sunrise Movement, and they insisted that Feinstein pass Cortez's new Green Deal. I'm sure many of you have seen this video. The video was edited to make Feinstein look foolish. But the story is the propaganda that was believed by these children. The children said, scientists say we have only 12 years to turn this around. They got that from AOC, who said that the previous week. And the children believe this as a fact. And their teachers are teaching them these things. The adult sponsor spoke up, Senator, if this doesn't get turned around in 12 years, you are looking at the faces of those who have to live with the consequences. Any plan that doesn't take bold, transformative action is not what we need. Then one of the children cried out, we're the ones who are going to be impacted. So imagine if as a child, you are told that the world environment will be destroyed in 12 years because of CO2. Of course you're going to be alarmed. AOC is a recent public school graduate. It's no wonder that she believes the global warming hysteria, because that's the nonsense that was taught in her environmental earth science class. Over the last year, I've been reading quite a few articles stating that the global warming movement was on its way out because the public is becoming skeptical of global warming. It's very difficult to maintain the lie when there's been no global warming for the last 15 years. So I looked this up again, and I noticed that the Gallup organization keeps changing the story. In 2010, Gallup reports, America's global warming concerns continue to drop. Multiple indicators show less concern, more feelings that global warming is exaggerated. But then in 2017, Global warming concerns at 3 decades high in the United States. Then in 2018, global warming concerns steady despite some partisan shifts. So it just goes to show you don't trust the pollsters. You get the story you want given the questions that you ask. This all comes back to the question I had last week. What is driving this irrational fear of global warming? This irrational fear of CO2? And the irony in all this is that these social liberals will destroy the environment, but not through CO2. But Revelation 6:14, the sky was split apart like a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. Revelation 8:7, and a third of the earth is burned up. Revelation 11:18, God will destroy those who destroy the earth. This all comes about both by man's warfare, nuclear warfare in World War III, and God's direct apocalyptic judgments. Finally, one more sign of the time. Democrat presidential candidate Kamala Harris said sex work should be decriminalized. In other words, legalize prostitution. Why? Because she says we can't criminalize consensual behavior. And this is just another result of the secular, humanistic, materialistic, anti-God view of law and morality. That law is simply a function of human desire. That law is whatever people want to do. And this is the path to Sodom. Under this ideology, every immorality is a virtue and it's legalized. If God's people ever get a chance to create a country founded on Christian values, the founding documents would contain a detailed explanation of the biblical basis for morality and law. That law is not a function of freedom, but the moral law of God. This was never done in America. And to once again quote this little booklet by Melvin Tinker, if we are to change the present culture, we must commend God's truth, we must be culturally engaged, and we must be involved in courageous refusal and refutation. Thank you for listening. The contact information is on the closing slide. Don't forget to subscribe. Hit that subscribe button on your screen and help give some moral support to the cause. May God richly bless you. May God strengthen you and give you wisdom as you stand in the evil day and having done everything to stand.